The wind howled through the Judean wilderness, sweeping across the barren landscape. The night was deep, the stars burning like watchful eyes in the heavens. There, in the silence, stood a man, his face set with determination, his eyes filled with something no one had ever seen before. This was Jesus of Nazareth, the one they whispered about in hushed voices. Some called him a prophet. Others feared he was a madman. But those who looked deeper saw something else, something divine. Tonight everything was about to change. His journey had already begun, from the humble town of Nazareth, where he worked as a carpenter, to the moment he stood before John the Baptist, the Jordan River swirling around his feet. John hesitated, his voice trembling. "I am not worthy to baptize you." But Jesus stepped forward. "Let it be so now, for this is necessary to fulfill all righteousness." And as he was lowered into the water, the heavens opened. A voice, thunderous yet tender, filled the air. "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." The Spirit descended like a dove, resting upon him. It was a sign, a call, a moment that marked the beginning of something the world would never forget. But before he could step into his mission, he had to face the darkness. The Spirit led him into the wilderness. 40 days, 40 nights, no food, no water. Only the burning heat of the sun by day and the bitter cold by night. The hunger gnawed at his stomach. His body grew weak, but his spirit remained unshaken. And then the enemy came. From the shadows, a voice slithered through the silence, smooth, cunning, ancient. "If you are the Son of God, command these stones to become bread." Hunger pressed against him like a weight, but Jesus lifted his gaze. His voice was steady. "It is written, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds from the mouth of God." The air trembled. The enemy did not relent. In an instant, they were standing high upon the temple's pinnacle. The city sprawled below like an open hand. The tempter's voice coiled around him. "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down. For it is written, He shall command His angels concerning you, and in their hands they shall bear you up." Jesus did not waver. His eyes burned with authority. "It is written, You shall not put the Lord your God to the test." And still, the enemy was not finished. In the blink of an eye, the world lay before them. Kingdoms, riches, power, glory beyond measure. The voice was softer now, enticing. "All this I will give you if you bow down and worship me." Silence. Then a voice like thunder. "Away from me, Satan. For it is written, You shall worship the Lord your God, and Him only shall you serve." The enemy recoiled. Darkness trembled. And then he was gone. The test was over. The battle had been won. Angels came, ministering to him, and now his mission would begin. The Sea of Galilee stretched before him, shimmering under the golden light of the sun. The water lapped against the shore where fishermen cast their nets, their hands rough from years of labor. 2 brothers worked tirelessly, Simon and Drew. Their father had raised them by the sea, teaching them to fish from the time they could walk. Then they saw him, a man unlike any other. His eyes, fierce yet full of compassion, met theirs. And then he spoke, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." A strange fire burned in their hearts. Without hesitation, they dropped their nets. The boats, the fish, the life they had known, it no longer mattered. They followed. Further down the shore, another call. 2 more brothers, James and John, mending their nets with their father. He looked at them and said the same. "Follow me." And at once, they left everything. The boats, their father, their future. They didn't fully understand why, but they knew they had to go. Others would follow. A tax collector named Matthew, despised by his people. A zealot named Simon, burning with rebellion. Thomas, skeptical but drawn to the truth. And Judas, the one who would later betray him. 12 men, ordinary, flawed, uncertain. Yet they were chosen. And their journey with Jesus had only just begun. The news of him spread like wildfire, whispers in the markets, gasps in the synagogues. The carpenter's son from Nazareth, he spoke with power, and he did things no man had ever done. It began in Cana, a quiet village nestled in the hills of Galilee. A wedding feast. Laughter, music, the scent of roasted lamb filling the air. But then, disaster. The wine had run out. The shame of the hosts was unbearable. Mary, his mother, turned to him. "They have no more wine." He looked at her. His time had not yet come. But still, she believed. She turned to the servants. "Do whatever he tells you." And he spoke, "Fill the jars with water, 6 stone jars." The servants filled them to the brim, puzzled, hesitant. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." A pause. The master tasted it. His eyes widened in shock. This is the finest wine." A miracle, the first of many. But it was only the beginning. In Capernaum, a nobleman came running, desperation in his voice. "My son is dying. Please, come and heal him." Jesus met his gaze. "Go, your son will live." The man hesitated, but then, something in Jesus' voice made him believe. He turned and left. And as he neared his home, a servant ran to him, breathless. "Your son is alive," he asked. "When did he recover?" And they told him. The fever left at the very hour Jesus had spoken. He fell to his knees. He believed. And still, Jesus moved forward. In the synagogue, a man with a shriveled hand stood in the crowd. The Pharisees watched, waiting, ready to condemn. It was the Sabbath. No work could be done. But Jesus did not hesitate. "Stretch out your hand." The man obeyed. Before their very eyes, the hand straightened. Strength returned. A miracle. A sign. The Pharisees whispered among themselves. They did not rejoice. They plotted. But Jesus had no fear. The blind, the lame, the lepers, he healed them all. He touched the untouchable, spoke to the forgotten, lifted up the broken, and the crowds grew. Thousands followed, hanging on his every word, but not everyone rejoiced. Darkness stirred in the shadows. And soon, the opposition would rise. The sea was restless that night. The sky churned with angry clouds. Jesus and his disciples set out across the water, exhaustion settling in after long days of teaching and healing. As they sailed, Jesus lay down in the stern of the boat, his body weary, his eyes closing. And then the storm came. Winds howled, waves crashed, water surged over the sides. The boat pitched wildly, thrown like a toy upon the raging sea. Panic, shouts, desperate hands grasping at the ropes. And still Jesus slept. Finally they shook him awake, fear gripping their voices. "Master, do you not care that we are perishing?" He rose. The wind screamed around him, the sea rising like a beast ready to consume them. But Jesus was unmoved. He lifted his hand. "Peace, be still." Instant silence. The wind died. The waves melted into stillness. The disciples stood frozen, fear, awe. Who is this, that even the wind and the sea obey him? But their journey was not over. They reached the other side, the land of the Gadarenes, a desolate place where only the most tormented souls dwelled. And there, from the tombs, came a man. His body bore the scars of chains he had broken. His eyes burned with madness. His voice was not his own. The demons within him screamed, "What do you want with us, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" Even they knew who he was. Jesus looked at them, his voice steady. "What is your name?" A guttural reply. "Legion, for we are many." A shudder ran through the crowd. The demons trembled. They begged, "Do not send us into the abyss." Jesus pointed to a herd of swine. "Go." A cry rang out. The man fell to the ground, gasping as the spirits fled. The pigs shrieked, rushing into the water, vanishing beneath the waves. The people of the town came running. And there they saw him, The man who had once been lost, now clothed, sitting at Jesus' feet in his right mind. But fear gripped them. They did not rejoice. They begged Jesus to leave, and so he did. But as he stepped into the boat, the man cried out, "Let me come with you." Jesus smiled. "No, go home. Tell them what the Lord has done for you." And he did. His story spread through the land. And yet, darkness still loomed on the horizon. The crowds followed him, their voices rising in awe and wonder. But in the shadows, whispers grew. The Pharisees, the scribes, the teachers of the law, jealousy burned within them. They saw his miracles, they heard his words, and they feared him. He spoke of a kingdom, one not of this world. He forgave sins, something only God could do. He dined with tax collectors, touched lepers, allowed sinners to wash his feet with their tears. And worst of all, the people loved him. They had to stop him. But Jesus walked on, undeterred. He knew what lay ahead. One day, as he taught in the temple, they came to trap him. A woman, dragged through the streets, thrown before him, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling. A Pharisee sneered, "Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery. The law of Moses says she must be stoned. What do you say?" The crowd hushed. A test, a trap. If he condemned her, his message of mercy would be shattered. If he freed her, he would break the law. Jesus said nothing. He knelt, his finger tracing patterns in the dust. Impatience grew. "Well, what is your answer?" Then he spoke. "Let him who is without sin cast the first stone." Silence. One by one, they dropped their stones. The oldest left first, then the young, until none remained. Jesus turned to the woman. "Where are your accusers?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "There are none, Lord." He smiled. "Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more." The whispers in the shadows turned to anger. He was dangerous. He had to be stopped. It was a message that reached him on the road. "Lord, the one you love is sick, Lazarus, his friend." Mary and Martha's brother. But Jesus did not hurry. He waited. 2 days passed before he turned to his disciples. "Let us go to him." They hesitated. "But Lord, he is already dead. It is too late." Jesus' eyes burned with something they could not understand. "He is only sleeping. You will see the glory of God." They walked to Bethany. The house was filled with mourning. Martha ran to him, tears streaking her face. "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Jesus held her gaze. "Your brother will rise again. I know, in the resurrection at the last day." He shook his head. "I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live." Mary came, falling at his feet. "Lord, if only you had been here." Jesus saw her tears, he saw the sorrow, and he wept. Then he rose. "Take me to him." They led him to the tomb. A stone rolled over its entrance. "Roll the stone away." Martha hesitated. "Lord, by now there will be a terrible smell." "He has been dead 4 days." Jesus looked at her. "Did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" The stone was rolled away. A hush fell over the crowd. Jesus lifted his face to heaven. "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I say this that they may believe you sent me." Then, with a voice that shook the very ground, "Lazarus, come forth." A gasp, a murmur, and then movement. From the darkness of the tomb, a figure emerged, wrapped in grave clothes, eyes blinking in the sunlight, alive. The dead man walked, and the whispers in the shadows became shouts. The leaders were enraged. This man must die, and Jesus. He knew his time was near. The time had come. Jesus stood on the Mount of Olives, gazing at Jerusalem, the city that would welcome him with praise, yet condemn him with hatred. He knew what lay ahead, but still he stepped forward. He sent 2 disciples ahead. Go into the village. You will find a donkey tied there. Untie it and bring it to me." They obeyed. And soon he sat upon the donkey, riding toward the great city. The people saw him coming, and suddenly a cry rang out, "Hosanna! Hosanna to the Son of David!" They tore branches from the trees, laying them in the street. They spread their cloaks before him, their voices rising in worship. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." But in the crowd there were others, watching, scheming, the Pharisees, their faces dark with anger. "Teacher, rebuke your disciples." Jesus looked at them and said, "If they remain silent, the very stones will cry out." He entered the city, but he did not rejoice. He wept, "Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often I have longed to gather your children together, as a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, but you were not willing. Your house is left to you desolate." The days passed. The tension grew. And then came the night of the Passover. The disciples gathered in the upper room. The table was set, the lamb prepared, but Jesus was troubled. He took the bread, lifting his eyes. "This is my body, broken for you. Take, eat." Then the cup. "This is my blood of the new covenant, poured out for the forgiveness of sins. Do this in remembrance of me." They ate, they drank. But one among them had already made his decision. Jesus turned to him, "What you must do, do quickly." Judas rose and slipped into the night. The others did not understand. But Jesus did. The end was near. The night was heavy. Jesus led his disciples to the Garden of Gethsemane, the olive trees swaying under the moonlight. His heart was burdened, his steps slow. He turned to Peter, James, and John. "Stay here, watch and pray." Then, alone, he fell to the ground. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not my will, but yours be done." Sweat like drops of blood fell from his brow. The weight of the world pressed upon him, the sins of mankind, the wrath of God. And yet he rose, the sound of footsteps, the flicker of torches. The soldiers had come, and at their front, Judas. The traitor stepped forward, his face unreadable. And then he kissed him. "Rabbi." Jesus met his eyes. "Judas, do you betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" The soldiers surged forward. Peter, in a flash of rage, drew his sword, striking a servant of the high priest. The man cried out, clutching his bleeding ear. But Jesus raised his hand. "No more of this." He touched the man's wound. It healed instantly. Then he turned to the crowd. "Have you come with swords and clubs as though I were a criminal? I was with you every day in the temple, and you did not lay a hand on me. But this is your hour, the power of darkness." They seized him. The disciples scattered into the night. The night was filled with chaos. They dragged Jesus through the streets, torchlight flickering against the stone walls of Jerusalem. The high priest's house loomed ahead, its gates opening to receive the prisoner. Inside, the Sanhedrin, the ruling council, was already gathered. False witnesses were brought forward. Their words stumbled over each other, contradicting themselves. "He said he would destroy the temple," one man claimed. Another scoffed. "He calls himself the Son of God." Jesus stood silent. He did not defend himself. The high priest, Caiaphas, rose to his feet, frustration in his eyes. "I charge you under oath. Tell us if you are the Messiah, the Son of God." A hush fell over the room. Then Jesus spoke, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power, coming on the clouds of heaven." Caiaphas tore his robes. "Blasphemy, you have all heard it. What is your verdict?" "Guilty," they cried. "He must die." They spat on him, struck him, covered his face and mocked, "Prophesy, Messiah, who hit you?" Outside, in the courtyard, Peter stood in the shadows watching. Fear gripped his heart. He had followed at a distance, desperate to see what would happen. Then a servant girl pointed at him. "You were with him. You are one of his disciples." Peter's heart pounded. "I don't know what you're talking about." Another voice. I've seen you with him." "I swear, I don't know him." A third man stepped forward. "Your accent gives you away. You are Galilean. You were with Jesus." Peter's breath came in gasps. His fear overtook him. "I don't know the man." At that moment, the rooster crowed. Peter turned, and across the courtyard, Jesus looked at him. His eyes were not filled with anger, not with disappointment, but sorrow. Peter stumbled back, his chest tightening, his breath shallow. And he ran into the night, into the darkness. And he wept bitterly. Morning broke over Jerusalem, cold and gray. They led Jesus to Pilate, the Roman governor. The priests stood before him, their voices urgent. "This man claims to be a king. He stirs up rebellion." Pilate studied the prisoner. This man, beaten, bound, blood drying on his face, was no threat to Rome. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked. Jesus met his gaze. "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my followers would fight. But my kingdom is from another place." Pilate was unsettled. He turned to the crowd. "I find no fault in him." But the priests raged. "If you let him go, you are no friend of Caesar." Pilate hesitated. Then, an idea. "It is custom to release a prisoner at Passover. Whom do you choose, this Jesus or Barabbas?" Barabbas, a murderer, a rebel, a man filled with hate. The crowd roared. "Give us Barabbas." Pilate's stomach churned. "Then what shall I do with Jesus?" The priests led the chant. "Crucify him! Crucify him!" Pilate washed his hands in a basin of water. "I am innocent of this man's blood." And he handed Jesus over to be flogged. They stripped him, tied him to the whipping post. The Roman soldiers laughed as they raised the scourge, a whip of leather, laced with bone and metal. The first lash struck. Pain exploded through his body. The second. The third. Again, until his back was torn, flesh hanging in ribbons, blood pooling at his feet. Then they twisted a crown of thorns and shoved it onto his head. Blood ran down his face. They draped a purple robe over his shoulders, mocking. "Hail, King of the Jews!" They struck him, spit on him. And then, at last, they led him away. To die. The sun had risen, but for Jesus, the world was dark. The soldiers placed a heavy wooden cross upon his torn back. His body trembled under its weight. Each step forward was agony. The crowd lined the streets, some weeping, others mocking. "He saved others, but he cannot save himself," they sneered. Jesus stumbled. The cross crushed him to the ground. A soldier grabbed a man from the crowd, Simon of Cyrene. "You carry his cross." Simon lifted the beam, following behind the broken man. Women wept as he passed. But Jesus turned to them. "Do not weep for me. Weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore.'" They reached the hill Golgotha, the place of the skull. The soldiers ripped the robe from his back, reopening the wounds. They threw him onto the cross, stretching his arms wide. The first nail pierced his wrist. Pain, white-hot, searing through his body, the second nail. His feet were placed together. The hammer struck again. The cross was lifted. Dropped into the ground with a sickening jolt. Jesus hung there, gasping for breath. The crowd jeered. The priests smirked. The soldiers gambled for his robe. Above him the sign read, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews." One of the criminals crucified beside him mocked, "If you are the Christ, save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him. "Do you not fear God? We deserve this, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned to Jesus. "Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus, with pain in his voice, answered, "Truly, I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." The sky darkened. For 3 hours the sun refused to shine. Jesus looked down. His mother stood there, heartbroken. Beside her, John. "Woman, behold your son." And to John, "Behold your mother." He gasped for air. His body was failing. "I thirst." A soldier lifted a sponge soaked in vinegar to his lips. He barely tasted it. Then, a cry, unlike any other. my God, why have you forsaken me?" The weight of sin crushed him. The wrath of God poured upon him. The punishment of the world, carried by one. Then, he lifted his head. His voice rang out, "It is finished." He breathed his last, and the earth shook. The temple veil, torn in two, the graves split open. The centurion fell to his knees. Truly, this was the Son of God. But the story did not end there. 3 days passed. The tomb was sealed. Guards stood watch. And then, at the first light of dawn, the stone was rolled away. The grave was empty. Jesus had risen. Death was defeated. Sin was conquered. The kingdom of God had triumphed, and his name would never be forgotten. Forever, he reigns. As we reflect on the incredible life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, we are reminded that his love, sacrifice, and victory over death offer us hope and redemption. His story is not just in the past, it is alive in us today. If this story touched your heart, don't let it end here. Embrace his love, follow his example, and share his message with the world. Remember, Jesus invites you to experience the freedom and grace that he offers. If you're ready to learn more about his teachings, or take your journey of faith further, be sure to subscribe to our channel and share this video with others who need to hear the good news. Thank you for watching, and may the love of Jesus guide you every day.